The man dies 6 hours after a Soviet soldier gives him a piece of bread. He does not die from a bullet, from the cold, or from an illness that had been developing for weeks. He dies because he ate. The soldier who handed him the bread, a young man in his early 20s who had spent months watching people die on the Vistula front, stands over the body without understanding what has just happened. He had done the only thing he could think to do for a man reduced to skin and bone: feed him. And that gesture, the most basic of all, had just killed him. In the days that followed, the field doctors arriving behind the assault troops would learn the technical name for what they had just witnessed. But at that moment, in the snow-covered yard of a camp they still did not know how to name, there was only a soldier standing beside a body, with a half-eaten crust of bread still clutched in the dead man's hand. That was what the Red Army found at Auschwitz on the 27th of January 1945, a place where even saving someone could kill them. The 60th Army of the First Ukrainian Front had not been ordered to liberate any camp. It was advancing as part of the Vistula Oder offensive, pushing back what remained of German positions in southern Poland, with Auschwitz appearing only as a minor notation on reconnaissance maps. Another industrial installation linked to the IG Farben synthetic rubber plant, in a region saturated with smoke and destruction. Lieutenant General Vasily Petrenko, commanding the 107th Infantry Division, had received no specific orders explaining what the place was or what he would find there. Decades later, already retired, he would write in his memoirs that had the High Command known what Auschwitz really contained, the attack plans would have been different. But in January 1945, to the Soviet chain of command, Auschwitz was a set of coordinates, not a warning. Petrenko had spent almost 4 years on the Eastern Front. He had seen Stalingrad. He had seen entire villages devastated by the retreating Wehrmacht, bodies stacked in roadside ditches, the familiar landscape of an army that had spent too long learning not to be surprised by anything. Auschwitz broke that habit, he later said, in a phrase that would be quoted in nearly every subsequent account of that day, that he, a man who had seen people die every day, was shaken by a hatred unlike anything he had ever known. He said that until then he had read pamphlets about the German treatment of the Jews, but none of them mentioned what was being done to women, children, and the elderly. He said it was at Auschwitz that he understood for the first time exactly what the fate of those people had been. Advance troops from the 100th and 107th Divisions crossed the first stretches of barbed wire without encountering resistance. The Germans had evacuated the bulk of the camp 9 days earlier, forcing nearly 60,000 prisoners westward in columns on foot, in temperatures that fell below -20 degrees Celsius, in what history would eventually call the death marches. About 7,000 people were left behind, almost all of them too sick or too weak to walk, abandoned in the barracks without guards because by then they were no longer considered worth shooting. When the Soviet soldiers entered, they found no guards, no occupied watchtowers, nothing but the same strange silence they had already noticed in the surrounding villages, closed in on themselves, with no one willing to speak about what had been happening only a few kilometers from their homes. The soldiers who looked into the barracks needed a moment for their eyes to adjust to the darkness before they could fully make out what was in front of them. 3-tier wooden bunks, so narrow that barely one person could lie on their side on each level, and yet with 2, 3, sometimes 4 bodies pressed together on every plank. Some of those bodies moved slowly when they heard unfamiliar footsteps. Others did not move at all, and at first glance it was not always easy to tell which category each one belonged to. The air inside had an almost physical density, heavy with disease and a cold that even the mass of bodies could not soften. No soldier who entered those barracks that first morning came out without needing, for at least a few seconds, to breathe fresh air before continuing. Inside one of the warehouses in the area known by prisoners as Canada, a group of soldiers opened a door and found 7 tons of human hair, compressed into bales, ready to be shipped to German textile factories that turned it into felt and thread. These were not loose clumps. It was hair systematically cut from newly arrived women before they were taken to the gas chambers, packaged according to the same industrial logic as any other raw material. One of the soldiers who documented the discovery, an engineer by training assigned to reconnaissance duties, stood in front of the bales trying to understand what kind of system had to exist for cutting a woman's hair moments before killing her to make economic sense. He found no answer that satisfied him. He left the warehouse and never went back inside. Petrenko immediately ordered the medical units of the 107th, 108th, and 322nd Divisions to enter the camp with their field hospitals. The order was simple: open the showers in the military hospitals to the prisoners and have the field kitchens feed them. It was the logical response to starving bodies: food, hot water, warmth. No one in those units yet knew that the same response, applied without medical knowledge that did not yet exist, would kill hundreds of the people they were trying to save. The human body, subjected to months or years of extreme starvation, changes its internal chemistry in order to survive on almost nothing. When it suddenly receives a normal quantity of food, the body cannot process the abrupt influx of glucose and electrolytes. The heart, weakened and adapted to a metabolism that has nearly shut down, cannot withstand the sudden demand to reactivate every system at once, and it fails. This mechanism, which medicine would decades later call refeeding syndrome, had no name in January 1945. Soviet doctors saw only patients who improved for hours, who regained some color, who sometimes even smiled, and who then, without any visible warning, stopped breathing. Of the approximately 4,500 prisoners treated in Soviet and Polish Red Cross field hospitals in the weeks after liberation, at least 500 died, many from a cause no one yet knew how to prevent. A Polish Red Cross orderly who worked side by side with Soviet medical personnel during those first days, Tadeusz Kuczynski, later recalled that some of the sick did not even understand that they were free. They ate because they were hungry, not because they knew that hunger finally had a guaranteed end. The physician and researcher Mark Dworjecki, himself a survivor of 10 different camps, spent the following years documenting these inexplicable deaths. Cases of patients who by any ordinary logic should have survived and yet collapsed hours after their first solid meal. No one at the time had a complete explanation. Dworjecki continued that research for years after the war, convinced that documenting with clinical precision what he himself had endured in different camps could at least prevent the next generation of doctors from facing the same bewilderment when confronted with bodies dying for reasons that still had no name. The only thing Soviet doctors learned, through the repeated loss of patients they had just rescued, was to ration food in tiny amounts, watch closely those who ate too quickly, and turn the most basic act of assistance, feeding someone who was starving, into a procedure requiring extreme caution. Hunger was not the only invisible threat. Years of overcrowding and filthy barracks had turned the camp into a breeding ground for typhus, spread by lice infesting every garment, every mattress, every centimeter of cloth that had passed over a prisoner's body. As soon as Soviet doctors established their first aid stations, they had to impose quarantine, isolate those with symptoms, burn infected clothing, fumigate entire barracks with the same type of insecticide the Germans had stored there for other purposes. Soldiers entering the barracks to disinfect them found, between the planks and rotting straw of the bunks, more bodies than they had counted on the first day. Prisoners who had died in the hours after the army arrived, too weak even for liberation to reach them in time. The quarantine lasted for weeks. Soldiers who had fought their way across half of Europe now spent their days disinfecting the clothing of the dead, counting corpses, and trying to contain an epidemic with the limited resources of an army that still had Berlin ahead of it. Almost all the German personnel had fled before the Soviet troops arrived, but not everyone. In the days following liberation, Soviet patrols found several guards hiding in the surrounding area, hoping the front would pass without noticing them, trusting that a uniform stripped of insignia and a carefully prepared story would be enough to disappear among the mass of civilians and prisoners of war left in the wake of the Soviet advance. Those captured still wearing uniforms, or recognized by survivors who pointed at them with trembling fingers, were not always given a formal trial. Some were summarily executed on the spot by officers who saw no reason to apply the conventions of war to men they had just seen administering, until the previous day, a system of extermination. Those handed over alive to Soviet intelligence faced something else: interrogation. One such interrogation, later preserved in Soviet military archives, revealed a pattern that would repeat itself in dozens of similar cases over the following months. The guard explained that when he arrived at the camp, he had been shown the entire process, from the arrival of the trains to cremation, and told that his job was to keep the flow moving, that there could be no delays, that everything had to proceed quickly, and that if he had moral doubts, he had better keep them to himself because there was no room there for weakness. The Soviet officer questioning him asked whether he had experienced those doubts. The man replied that at first he had, but in time he became accustomed to it. He stopped seeing the prisoners as people. They became units to be processed, and if he thought of them as people, He could not do his job, so he stopped thinking. That answer, more than any oven or warehouse, was what finally broke several of the Soviet officers conducting those interrogations. They were not facing ideological fanatics, incapable of reason. They were facing men who described, with the same naturalness with which a factory worker describes an assembly line, the process by which they had ceased to recognize other human beings as human. One of the interpreters involved in those interrogations later wrote that he left every session with the feeling that he had touched something without a bottom. Not the cruelty of a monster, which would have been easier to process, but the capacity of an ordinary man to switch off, through sheer administrative habit, the part of himself that recognized the suffering of others. Not everyone captured responded with that kind of resignation. Another guard, questioned by a different officer only a few days later, refused to show any remorse. He insisted, with a firmness that unsettled his interrogator, that he had fulfilled his duty to his country and that war had rules of its own, different from those of peacetime. The interrogator then asked which rule of war explained the killing of children who posed no military threat. The guard did not answer that question. He changed the subject, speaking instead about military discipline, superior orders, and the need to maintain order in a system as large as Auschwitz. The Soviet officer noted in his report that this man, unlike the previous one, did not appear to be searching for any form of internal moral justification. He simply did not believe one was necessary. Later investigations, fed by documents the Germans had failed to burn in time, revealed something that disturbed the Soviet officers almost as much as the camp itself. Auschwitz had not functioned in hermetic isolation. The textile factories that purchased human hair knew where it came from. The dentists and Reichsbank technicians who processed gold extracted from the mouths of corpses knew where it came from. The engineers at the company that had designed industrial cremation furnaces capable of processing volumes no ordinary cemetery could ever require knew what they would be used for. The company supplying the gas knew the final destination of every delivery. None of them had personally activated a gas chamber, and that distance allowed them, just like the interrogated guard, to continue thinking of themselves as simple suppliers fulfilling a contract. The system had not required only a handful of fanatics willing to kill with their own hands. It had required an entire chain of people willing to look away in exchange for a reasonable benefit. That revelation changed, among the Soviet officers reconstructing it document by document, the way they understood what they had just liberated. This was not the crime of an isolated group of sadists whom war had placed in the wrong location. It was a system that, in order to function for years on that scale, had required the silent cooperation of thousands of people who never set foot in the camp. Among the soldiers who entered Auschwitz during those days were a considerable number of Soviet Jews, and for them the experience carried an additional layer that their comrades did not entirely share. Some spoke Yiddish and could communicate directly with survivors who had no other language in which to explain what they had seen. Some had relatives in the regions from which large numbers of the victims had been deported. For them, understanding what had happened there was not a gradual intellectual process, as it was for the rest of the column. It was immediate, personal, and carried with it the implicit question of whether someone of their own blood had passed along that same platform, through that same selection, into that same smoke. That additional burden did not appear in military reports, which spoke of casualties, advances, and completed objectives. Instead, it appeared in private letters many of those soldiers wrote to their families in the weeks that followed, letters reviewed by military censors before being allowed through, and which in more than one case never reached their destination, confiscated without explanation, and returned to their authors, if they survived the war, only decades later, when Soviet archives began to open selectively after Stalin's death. As the weeks passed, while the field hospitals continued treating survivors and intelligence units continued questioning captured guards, a change began to appear in the Soviet soldiers themselves. Men who had spent years at the front, hardened by battles that had reduced entire cities to rubble, began showing signs their officers did not fully know how to name: long silences, difficulty sleeping, a reluctance to speak of the camp even among themselves, as if putting it into words would give it a permanence they preferred to avoid. Others, by contrast, could not stop talking about it, repeating the same details again and again to anyone willing to listen, as if they needed to unload something that had no other way out. No military manual of the time contained a protocol for what these men were processing. War had taught them how to live with death in battle. 4 entire infantry divisions, the 100th, 107th, 108th, and 322nd, rotated through the complex in the weeks following liberation, meaning that direct exposure to what Auschwitz contained was not limited to a handful of advanced troops, but extended to thousands of men involved in security, disinfection, transport of the wounded, and guarding German prisoners of war. Every one of those thousands of soldiers later returned to his unit, his family, or civilian life in the Soviet post-war world, carrying his own version of the same experience. No systematic study was conducted at the time on the psychological impact of that mass exposure. The very concept of war trauma as it is understood today would still take decades to develop within Soviet military medicine. What remains instead are fragments, letters, late memoirs, interviews given in old age, all converging on the same point that this particular winter, out of all the winters of the war, was the one none of them ever managed to leave completely behind. Auschwitz taught them something different, that death could be organized, planned, and administered through schedules and shifts without requiring a single bullet. Years later, retired and by then a military historian, Petrenko reviewed the archives of the 60th Army itself in search of an answer to a question that had followed him. If Soviet High Command had possessed precise information about what Auschwitz was, would the order to advance on the 26th of January 1945 have been different? His conclusion, published in his memoirs, was that neither he nor his direct superiors had that information when they received the order. Military intelligence and the NKVD had indeed gathered information about the region throughout the war, but that information was never translated into specific operational instructions for combat units. And the two official bulletins published by the Soviet news agency at the end of January 1945 about the liberation never once mentioned that the place had been used for the systematic extermination of the Jewish people. Petrenko did not arrive at a comfortable conclusion. Decades of later research would suggest that even if the assault units lacked that tactical information, the leadership in Moscow did know, in general terms, what was happening in the occupied territories, and that specifically saving Jewish lives had never, within military calculations, been a priority considered important enough to alter the plan of attack. The distance between what Moscow probably knew and what it decided to do with that knowledge would remain, for later generations of historians, one of the uncomfortable questions that even the genuine heroism of the soldiers who entered the camp that day cannot fully resolve. Among those who arrived at the camp in those first days was a painter, Zinovy Tolkachev, a Ukrainian Jewish artist attached to advancing Red Army units as a visual documentarian. His job was not to photograph, but to draw, and that difference mattered. A camera could capture an instant, but Tolkachev had to stand before each scene long enough to transfer it to paper, holding his gaze on what most soldiers could barely look at from the corner of their eyes before turning away. He drew the faces of survivors with a level of detail that no military photograph of the period bothered to capture. Sunken eyes, hands reduced to bones covered by skin, the expression of someone who no longer expects anything. His drawings, later gathered into portfolios that circulated through Soviet institutions and eventually international museums, became some of the few artistic records made by someone present at the exact moment of liberation, before the scene became history and therefore manageable from a distance. Tolkachev exhibited part of the series in Krakow only months later, while the war was still going on, and continued working from the same sketches for years, as though one exhibition were not enough to discharge what he had seen. He never again painted any other episode of the war he had lived through with the same thematic intensity, even though he had been present on many other fronts. Auschwitz, he said in a late interview, was different from anything else he had ever tried to put onto paper. Among the 7,000 prisoners found alive were children. Eva Moseskor was 10 years old and 4 days short of her 11th birthday when Soviet soldiers entered the sector where she and her twin sister Miriam had survived the medical experiments of Dr. Yosef Mengele. Decades later, Kor would remember that day of white snow as the moment when, for the first time since arriving at the camp, she stopped feeling that her life depended on the will of someone who wanted her dead. But liberation did not answer the question she and thousands of children like her carried. Where were their parents, their older siblings, the rest of their families? Soviet officers, without any clear protocol for such a task, began organizing improvised registers, handwritten lists of names, repeated questions addressed to every new survivor who appeared. The Red Cross, once it managed to establish a stable presence in the area, sent more than 7,000 letters attempting to locate relatives of patients treated in the field hospitals. Most of those letters were never answered, not because they had been lost in the mail, but because there was no one left at the other end to answer them. Months after liberation, when the bulk of the Soviet army was already advancing toward Berlin, Auschwitz continued to function as a place of detention, though with the roles reversed. German prisoners of war, together with some Polish civilians detained for having declared themselves ethnically German during the occupation, were put to work dismantling the same barracks that had once confined others, taking apart piece by piece the nearby IG Farben synthetic rubber plant. No Soviet officer needed to explain the symmetry of that decision aloud. The men who had designed and sustained, even indirectly, a system of forced labor were now carrying bricks and dismantling structures under armed supervision on the same ground where others had once been supervised. It was not justice in any formal sense. There was no trial, no individual sentence. Only the practical logic of an army that needed labor and had prisoners available. But the geographical symmetry was not lost on anyone who had been there before. Among the survivors themselves, the arrival of the Soviets did not immediately dissolve the tensions the camp had created. For years, survival inside Auschwitz had depended, for some, on holding positions that provided access to better food, better clothing, less exposure to cold, working in kitchens, sorting warehouses, administrative tasks reserved by the Germans for trusted prisoners. Those positions had saved lives, but they had also generated resentments that liberation did not erase. In the days after January 27, survivors accused one another of collaboration, of saving their own lives at the expense of others. Some accusations justified and others not, all reflecting an uncomfortable truth the Soviet officers did not know how to process. Auschwitz had forced people to make impossible decisions in order to survive, and those decisions left wounds no war crimes tribunal was prepared to judge fairly. The most difficult case of all was that of those who had belonged to the Sonderkommando. The group of prisoners, almost all of them Jewish, forced to operate the crematory furnaces, remove bodies from the gas chambers, and sort the personal belongings of the newly murdered. In return for this work, they received slightly better rations and a temporary postponement of their own deaths, with the certainty that they themselves would periodically be eliminated so that no witnesses remained. A Soviet officer who interrogated one of the few survivors of that group found himself facing a question with no clear answer. Was this man a collaborator in the system that had exploited him to the limit, or was he, in the most literal sense, simply another victim, forced under immediate threat of death to take part in a process he had never chosen? The man being questioned had no comforting answer. He said, according to the record, that every day he survived was a day someone else had not survived in his place, and that this arithmetic would remain with him for the rest of his life, regardless of what any court decided. At Birkenau, a group of soldiers reached the remains of the crematoria that the Sonderkommando itself had tried to destroy during its revolt in October of the previous year, and that the SS had later blown up with explosives in the final days before, fleeing in a late attempt to erase evidence. Among the ruins, the foundations of the underground chambers were still visible, along with the marks of the ventilation grills through which gas crystals had been introduced, and on some surviving sections of wall, deep grooves left by human fingernails against the concrete. One soldier who examined those marks closely, needing no one to explain what had caused them, stepped away from the wall and never approached it again. Another, an officer with technical training, calculated aloud how many people could have been placed inside a space of those dimensions at one time, and the figure he arrived at left him silent for the rest of the tour. In one of the camp's brick buildings, a group of Soviet military doctors found files documenting medical experiments performed on prisoners, cold endurance tests, injections of toxic substances, forced sterilizations, surgeries performed without anesthesia. The records were written with a clinical detachment that made them even more disturbing. Every victim appeared as a test subject, every torture described as a procedure, every death recorded as a result. One of the Soviet doctors, a man who had spent years treating war wounds at the front, had to sit down halfway through reading. He could not continue. He had devoted his entire life to healing, and now had before him proof that other men with the same training had used that same knowledge to experiment on human beings as if they were laboratory material. He left the building without finishing the file. Someone else had to do it for him. Soviet intelligence services spent weeks reconstructing, from the available documents and the testimony of survivors still able to speak, the entire organizational structure of the camp. Who had commanded each sector? Who had signed transfer orders? Who had supervised selections on the ramp? That tedious, meticulous work stood in deliberate contrast to the scale of the crime it was trying to document. There was no way to process the full magnitude of what had happened all at once, so the investigators focused on the only thing they could control. One name at a time, one position at a time, one signature at a time, patiently building the map of individual responsibility that would later allow post-war courts to convict at least some of those who had operated the machinery, even though no sentence could ever balance what had been done. The soldier who had given the bread on the first morning was not the only one who carried a similar death with him. In the following days, while the field hospital was still trying to organize a system of controlled rations, several rank-and-file soldiers with no medical training unknowingly repeated the same mistake. Moved by the most basic impulse to help, they shared their own food with prisoners they found, only to learn hours later that the person had died. A lieutenant wrote in his diary that one of his men, a 20-year-old from a village near Smolensk, stopped speaking for almost a week after an elderly man to whom he had given part of his soup ration died that same night. According to the lieutenant, the young man kept repeating in a low voice that he had crossed half of Europe, firing a rifle without his hand trembling, and now a bowl of soup had broken him more than any battle. Once the medical officers understood the pattern, they issued a strict order. No soldier was to feed prisoners on his own. All food had to be distributed under the control of the medical units. The order saved lives, but it came too late for those who had already died, and too late to erase the guilt of those who had unknowingly hastened that ending with the best intentions in the world. Calculating how many people had died there proved almost as difficult as absorbing the fact that it had happened at all. The Germans had destroyed much of the transport documentation before fleeing, and the bodies of the overwhelming majority of victims had been cremated, leaving no remains that could be counted one by one. Soviet investigators arriving weeks after the combat troops had to reconstruct the scale from fragments. Surviving transport lists, survivor testimony about the frequency of trains, estimates of furnace capacity, the volume of warehouses filled with confiscated property. The result of that work, refined over decades by later research, pointed to more than 1 million people murdered in the Auschwitz-Birkenau complex alone, the overwhelming majority Jews deported from across Europe. But that figure came later, with time, archives, and method. On the 27th of January 1945, the soldiers walking among the remains of the furnaces had no number. They had the smell, which dozens of separate testimonies would later describe in different ways but with a consistency impossible to dismiss as coincidence. A mixture none of them had ever smelled before: organic decomposition, industrial disinfectant, ash, and something beneath all of it that doctors would later identify as the specific odor of extreme starvation, the human body consuming its own reserves down to the limit. That smell remained embedded in the memories of those who were there for years, decades, the rest of their lives. Several veterans interviewed long after the war said almost the same thing, in almost the same words, that certain ordinary smells, apparently unrelated to Auschwitz, could suddenly return them to that winter without warning, decades after they had left Poland. What those soldiers had witnessed so directly and personally became something different once filtered through the Soviet press. Articles published by Pravda and other official outlets described Nazi crimes against prisoners and against the Soviet people, but systematically avoided mentioning that the overwhelming majority of the victims had been murdered specifically because they were Jews. The editorial policy of the Soviet regime preferred a narrative of universal anti-Soviet suffering over one acknowledging racial persecution directed at a specific group, and that omission left many of the soldiers who had actually been there, who had heard the selection process on the ramp explained, who had seen entire communities killed because of their origin, and nothing else, in the uncomfortable position of watching their own country describe what they had seen with their own eyes differently and incompletely. Commander Vasily Gromadsky, leading one of the first units to enter the complex, later described a detail that captured the uncertainty of that first contact. He found a gate, locked with a padlock. Without even knowing whether it was the main entrance to the camp or the entrance to a secondary section, and had to order it forced open because there was no one in sight to ask. He walked 200 meters beyond that gate before seeing the first prisoners running toward his troops, around 300 of them, with striped uniforms hanging from bodies that barely supported them. More than 230 Soviet soldiers, including the commander of the 472nd Infantry Regiment, Semyon Lvovich Bezprozvany, died fighting to take Monowitz, the main camp, Birkenau, and the town of Auschwitz itself. 66 of them fell in the immediate buffer zone surrounding the complex. Those combat deaths, suffered while the army was still advancing without fully knowing what lay beyond the wire, were later overshadowed by the magnitude of what was discovered once the gunfire stopped, as though the conventional war that had caused them became almost a minor detail beside what waited behind the gates. In one of the barracks, soldiers found a group of children who did not fit with the rest of what they had seen until then. Twins, almost all of them, ranging in age from toddlers to teenagers, marked with tattooed numbers, and treated in a way that, within the overall horror of the camp, seemed different, almost careful. They soon understood why. These children had been separated from the other deportees on the selection ramp specifically because they were twins and placed under the direct supervision of Dr. Josef Mengele, who used them as subjects in comparative experiments, injections, transfusions, measurements, surgical procedures, all documented with the same pseudoscientific rigor that characterized the rest of the camp's medical apparatus. Mengele had fled before Soviet troops arrived. The children who survived his experiments remained there, waiting for a man who would never face trial for what he had done to them. Among them were 10-year-old Eva Moses, Kor, and her twin sister Miriam. Decades later, Kor would spend much of her adult life telling that story publicly, insisting that direct testimony, repeated again and again before new generations, was the only tool capable of compensating, even partially, for the absence of formal justice against the man who had turned her into a laboratory number. Petrenko remained in the Soviet army after the war, eventually rising to the rank of lieutenant general, and for decades published nothing about what he had seen that January. The Soviet Union did not encourage individual accounts of the war over the collective narrative of the heroism of the Soviet people, and a memory centered on the specific suffering of a single ethnic group fit poorly with that official narrative. Only after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, in the 1990s, did Petrenko publish his memoirs under a title that summarized better than any other phrase what that January day had done to his own biography. Before and after Auschwitz. He did not speak of a before and after the war, nor of a before and after battle. He spoke of a before and after that specific camp, as though an entire military life, Stalingrad included, could be cleanly divided into two halves by a single day in January. The soldier who gave bread to a man who died 6 hours later never published memoirs. There is no record of his full name in any of the archives consulted by historians who later reconstructed those first days, only a mention of his gesture in the diary of an officer who witnessed the scene and wanted to leave a record of it. Perhaps he continued fighting all the way to Berlin. Perhaps he died in the following weeks on another front. The only thing known with certainty is that somewhere in the post-war Soviet Union there was a man who carried for the rest of his life the knowledge that he had unintentionally killed the first person he had tried to save. That was the horror the Red Army faced when it liberated Auschwitz, the horror no military report ever recorded with precision, not only what the Germans had done, but the impossibility of completely undoing it, even with the best intentions, even after victory.